You know how it is, you want to really get a handle on a topic, go deeper than just the headlines, but wading through all the research. It can be pretty daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. Takes a lot of time.
Well, that's what we're here for. Today on the deep dive, we've tackled a really interesting piece of work. It's a systematic review, and it pulled together, get this, 75 longitudinal studies.
Wow, 75. That's substantial.
Right, all done between 2000 and 2021. And they're looking at something I think we all sort of feel is important. How the timing, when things happen, and for how long during childhood,
Hmm.
how those social and economic circumstances connect to learning and cognitive development later on.
Exactly. It's trying to move past just asking, did a child face hardship? Yes or no?
Right.
To really unpacking the when and the how long. So our mission today really is to explore what this big review found. How do these temporal things, the timing and duration of social economic factors, right,
Yeah.
from pregnancy up to early adolescence, how do they link up with education and cognitive skills across a person's life? And the hope is maybe we can spot those key moments, those windows where support could really, make a difference.
Okay, so quite a mission. Let's start at the top. What's the sort of the big picture finding from looking across all 75 of these studies?
Well, the headline is pretty clear, actually.
Yeah.
The when and the how long, the timing and duration of a child's exposure to different social and economic factors, they really do seem to significantly influence their path, educationally and cognitively.
Okay, so it definitely matters. Was this like a subtle thing or?
No, not at all subtle. It was quite strong. Something like 88% of the studies they reviewed found evidence for these kinds of temporal effects, as they call them.
88%. Wow. Okay, so it's not just if something happens, but the timeline is crucial.
Mm.
How did the researchers categorize these effects? How did they break it down?
They basically saw three main ways this plays out. First is just the duration, simply how long a child is in a particular situation.
Okay, length of time. Makes sense.
Second is the specific developmental timing, like does the age the child experiences something make a difference?
Ah, the when. Got it.
And third is what they called mobility, basically, changes in circumstances over childhood, moving into or maybe out of different kinds of social or economic situations.
Interesting. Okay, let's tackle that first one then. Duration. What did the review find about how, the sheer length of exposure affects kids?
Yeah, this was a big one. It came up in over half the studies, 55%.
Over half. Okay.
And the general pattern, maybe not surprisingly, was that longer or sort of repeated exposure to tough circumstances, think chronic material hardship, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
it was generally linked to poorer cognitive skills,
Mm-hmm.
socio-emotional development issues, more behavior problems. It kind of confirms that idea that being under prolonged stress really can take a toll.
Yeah, that feels intuitive, doesn't it? The longer a child's coping with significant challenges, the deeper the impact could potentially be. Did they have any specific examples in the review?
They did. One study they highlighted looked at maternal responsiveness, how warm and attuned a mother is.
Okay.
And it found that kids who had consistently high levels of that responsiveness, right, from infancy through their preschool years, they showed better cognitive development compared to kids who didn't have that steady, consistent experience.
So consistency matters. Sustained positive input makes a difference.
It really seems to. And that leads into a related idea they found, a kind of sub-theme you mentioned, accumulation.
Yeah, what was that about?
Right. So about 19 studies specifically pointed to this. The idea is that it's not just about one period of hardship. Each additional period, say, another year of food insecurity or staying in low socioeconomic status for longer,
Okay.
seemed to add to the negative impact. It had this kind of stacking effect, particularly on things like learning and numeracy skills.
Ah, so it accumulates, like each wave hits a bit harder or adds to the damage.
That seems to be the idea in those studies, yes.
Yeah.
A cumulative burden.
That's a powerful concept. It almost suggests that maybe stopping even one period of hardship could prevent that escalation.
That's certainly an implication you could draw, yeah. Preventing that pileup.
Okay. Now, was it always the case that longer hardship meant worse outcomes, like a straight line down?
Mostly, but not quite always. A few studies, not many, but a few, found something they called a threshold effect,
A threshold, meaning,
meaning that the negative impact might sort of level off after a certain point. It doesn't necessarily keep getting worse indefinitely with more duration.
huh, can you give an example?
Yeah, the one they mentioned was around institutionalization, like time spent in an orphanage or similar setting. For nonverbal abilities specifically, the negative impacts seem to kind of plateau after a certain duration of being institutionalized.
That's really interesting. So it didn't just keep dropping. Any idea why that might happen? Like, does the brain adapt or something?
The review didn't delve deep into the why for that specific finding, but it raises those questions definitely. Perhaps there's adaptation, or maybe the initial period has the most profound impact on that particular skill. It's complex.
Fascinating. So, yeah, generally longer hardship is worse, but maybe not always infinitely worse for every single outcome. There might be these plateaus. Okay, let's shift to the second big theme, developmental timing. Does when these things happen actually matter? Is there a difference if it happens in infancy versus, say, later childhood?
Absolutely. This is another key finding. About 35% of the studies found evidence that the age, the specific developmental stage when a child encounters certain things, is critical.
So there might be sensitive periods.
That's exactly what it suggests. Windows of development where exposure, positive or negative, might have a particularly strong effect.
Okay, were there any standout findings here? Any periods or factors that seemed especially sensitive to timing?
Yes, one finding came through really consistently. It was about maternal mental health, specifically during pregnancy.
During pregnancy. Wow.
Yeah. Multiple studies found a direct link between the mother's mental well-being while pregnant and her child's cognitive abilities later on in childhood.
That's incredibly early. What kinds of links are we talking about? How might that even work? Is it biological?
The review points to the potential for biological pathways, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Stress hormones, nutrient transfer, things that can affect fetal brain development. But the key finding from the review was simply the consistent association they observed across studies.
That really underscores how early development starts. Any other examples of timing effects?
Yes. There was research on interventions for kids who'd experienced what's called psychosocial deprivation.
Psychosocial deprivation. What does that involve generally?
It often refers to situations with a lack of consistent, responsive caregiving, maybe severe neglect, lack of stimulation, often seen in some institutional settings, for example.
Okay, got it. And the timing.
The studies found that kids who got intervention support, enriched caregiving before they hit their toddler years, generally had better cognitive outcomes than those who received similar help later on.
So getting in early, before toddlerhood, made a bigger difference for those kids.
It seemed to, yes. It really points towards those early years being a particularly potent time for catch-up, at least for certain cognitive skills impacted by that kind of deprivation.
The old early intervention idea seems to have real weight then. Okay, what about economic factors like poverty? How did timing play out there, especially concerning school and learning?
This was another area where timing seemed quite important, especially for early childhood, so birth through preschool.
The preschool years again.
Yes. Multiple studies linked economic factors like family income or being in poverty during that specific period to later educational outcomes and also cognitive outcomes. It really reinforces the idea that those foundational years are critical for setting trajectories.
And looking at educational outcomes more broadly, like school performance, staying in school, did the timing of social and economic factors matter across different school ages?
Here, the influence seemed pretty broad, actually. Many studies found that these factors impacted educational outcomes, things like grades, engagement in school, even getting qualifications later on, across basically all the stages they looked at, from the newborn period right through early adolescence.
So for education, the impact seems more continuous, less tied to one specific critical window.
It appears that way from this review, yes. A more pervasive influence throughout childhood and adolescence on the educational path.
Okay. Now, what about cognitive outcomes? Things like IQ, memory, executive function. Was the timing effect as clear-cut there?
It was a bit fuzzier for cognition, actually, more nuanced.
Oh, how so?
The findings suggested that whether timing mattered and which timing mattered might really depend on the specific cognitive skill you're looking at.
Ah, okay. So maybe memory is sensitive at one age, but reasoning skills at another.
Something like that, potentially. There wasn't one single sensitive period that jumped out as being critical for all aspects of cognition, in the same way that, say, pregnancy did for maternal mental health effects, or early childhood did for economic factors. It seems more complex, maybe skill-specific.
Right. So timing matters, definitely, especially early on and for education. But for specific cognitive skills, it might be more complicated. Okay, that brings us to the third theme, mobility effects. This was about changes over time, right? Moving in or out of situations.
Exactly. Looking at the impact of shifts, transitions, nearly a third of the studies, about 29%, investigated this. And they found these changes, this mobility, can have different effects compared to just being in a stable situation, whether that situation is good or bad.
Okay, can you give an example of how a change might play out differently?
Sure. One study they cited looked at maternal health again. An improvement in the mom's health early in the child's life was linked to benefits for the child's language development. That's the positive change.
Makes sense. Things got better, language improved.
But if that same mother's health later declined, that downward shift posed a risk to the child's language, even if things had been better earlier.
Ah, I see. So the direction of the change matters. An upward trajectory is good, but a later downward one can still hurt. It's not like the early benefit offered complete protection.
Precisely. It highlights that development is dynamic. Past advantages don't necessarily erase future risks if circumstances change negatively.
What kinds of changes were these mobility studies mostly looking at?
A lot focused on shifts in economic factors moving into or out of poverty, changes in food security, also changes in the home or neighborhood environment.
Like what specifically?
Things like changes in how parents were interacting with their kids, shifts in maternal mental health over time, or moving to a neighborhood with different levels of deprivation or resources.
Okay. And were they mostly tracking the outcomes during childhood as well?
Yes, generally. Since they were looking at changes happening during childhood, most of these mobility studies measure the effects on educational or cognitive outcomes also during childhood or adolescence.
Right, that follows. Now, you mentioned earlier that not all the studies found these timing or duration effects. There was a fourth group.
That's right. A relatively small group, about 12% of the studies, didn't find statistically significant evidence that timing or duration mattered for the specific outcomes they were measuring.
12%. Okay. Any thoughts from the review authors on why that might be? Does it mean time doesn't matter in those cases?
Not necessarily. They suggested it could sometimes be down to the study's design or methods.
How so?
Well, things like how they actually measured the exposure or the outcome.
Mm.
Or maybe the study just wasn't large enough, didn't have enough statistical power, they call it,
Right, power.
to detect an effect even if it was truly there. So a null finding doesn't always mean there's zero effect. It might just mean the study couldn't pick it up.
Gotcha. So the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, as they say. It could be methodological limitations.
It's a possibility to consider, yes.
Okay. So taking all this together, the duration effects, the timing, the mobility, even the studies that didn't find effects, it really hammers home the point that we need to think beyond just risk factor present or absent, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's kind of the core message. Understanding when kids experience things and for how long gives us a much richer, more dynamic picture than a simple snapshot. And that richer picture is potentially crucial for designing interventions or support systems that actually work well.
Because you might target support differently depending on whether a hardship is chronic versus temporary, or whether it's happening during a known sensitive period.
Exactly. Or you might focus on preventing negative transitions or supporting positive ones. It allows for more tailored approaches. The review contrasts this with some approaches like, some ways of looking at adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, which often focus on just counting up how many types of adversity someone faced without always capturing the timing or the duration piece as strongly. This review suggests those temporal dimensions add really important information.
Right, it adds layers of understanding. And you mentioned resilience, too. How does looking at timing and duration help with understanding resilience?
Well, by tracking changes over time, the mobility studies, for example,
Hmm.
you can start to see what happens when circumstances improve, what factors help kids bounce back or catch up when adversity lessens. Understanding those positive trajectories is just as important as understanding the negative ones.
So it's not just about vulnerability, but also about recovery and positive adaptation.
Precisely. It gives a more complete view of the developmental process.
Well, this has been incredibly illuminating, a really thorough deep dive into quite a complex area. If we were to boil it down, the major takeaway seems clear. Timing and duration aren't just minor details.
Not at all.
They have significant, often distinct impacts on how children learn and develop cognitively. It really pushes us beyond just identifying what challenges kids face to understanding the when and how long.
That's it, exactly. It's more than just ticking boxes of risk factors.
Yeah.
It points to these potentially critical periods, the importance of consistency, the cumulative weight of experiences, all things with real implications for how we might try to help kids and families thrive.
And for everyone listening, I hope this makes you think, how might these ideas apply in your world, whether you work with kids or you're a parent or involved in policy or just interested in how we develop. This lens of temporality, of timing and duration, it offers a potentially powerful way to think about supporting children's well-being.
And it definitely leaves us with some big questions to chew on, doesn't it?
Mm,
Like, if timing and duration have these distinct effects, where are the most critical intervention points if we really want to break cycles of inequity?
right. Where's the biggest leverage point?
Yeah. And also, how do we get better at actually measuring and addressing these cumulative effects, both the negative pileup of adversity, but also maybe the cumulative impact of positive supports over childhood? It's a huge challenge.
It really is, but a vital one. This research certainly gives us, as you said, some important clues and a framework for thinking about it. So if any part of this sparked your interest, definitely dig deeper, look into the review itself or related work on developmental timing or cumulative risk. There's so much more there.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.